For 19-year-old Lisa Stasi, the Christmas of 1984 was the worst she could remember. And that was really saying something, because even though Lisa was still very young, she had been through a lot. Born in the city of Huntsville, Alabama, whose 143,000 residents lived in the northernmost part of the state, best known as the Heart of Dixie, Lisa's father had died when she was just a child, and her brother would commit suicide. And so, after dropping out of high school at the age of 17, the beautiful teenager with the bright smile decided to leave Huntsville, her broken family, and her sad memories behind, and head for the metropolitan glamour and polish of Kansas City, Kansas, 670 miles to the northwest. But 2 years after that great escape, here she was, in the middle of a cold Midwest winter, in the middle of a collapsed marriage that had lasted only 1 year. In many ways, Lisa was worse off now than she'd been back in Alabama. She had no money, she had no job skills, and she had no home. But the one thing Lisa did have that made her happier than anything else in her life was her tiny 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany. Back when Lisa had arrived in Kansas City in 1983 and met her future husband, Carl, at a bar, she hadn't intended to get pregnant, but shortly after being introduced to the handsome 23-year-old sailor, the two of them had fallen in love, and the rest, as Lisa's mother would say, was history. Just 1 month after the young couple got married in August of 1984, little Tiffany Lynn was born on September 4th at a hospital on the Missouri side of Kansas City. But right after that, things started going downhill. By October, Carl was out of the Navy and out of work, and according to Lisa's friends and family, their marriage had turned violent. 2 months later, just a few days after Christmas, Carl would leave Lisa and Tiffany, and he would rejoin the military. With nowhere to go, Lisa and her baby moved into Hope House, which was a local shelter for homeless women. But just 1 month after that horrible Christmas, Lisa got the break she had been praying for. In the beginning of January 1985, the director of Hope House told Lisa that a local philanthropist had contacted the shelter saying that his newly founded charitable organization called Kansas City Outreach had heard about Lisa's plight and wanted to help her. Kansas City Outreach looked specifically for mothers with infants who needed housing and job training, and so Lisa was a perfect fit. Through their program, Lisa would be given her own furnished apartment and an $800 monthly allowance, along with some babysitting money. Lisa was thrilled. A few days after learning about this program and agreeing to be a part of it, Lisa had packed up all of her belongings and she had driven to her sister-in-law's house, where someone from the program was going to come and pick Lisa and her baby up and take them to their new apartment. As Lisa waited, she felt annoyed that her sister-in-law, Kathy, was not as excited about this opportunity as she was. In fact, Kathy was acting like this whole thing seemed kind of sketchy, that the Kansas City Outreach program was just too good to be true. And as a heavy snowstorm moved into the area that day, Kathy suggested in a hopeful voice that maybe the weather would keep her ride from being able to drive out to pick her up that day, and that maybe Lisa would have another day or two to decide if she really wanted to go through with this. But Lisa shrugged her off, and a little while later, right at the appointed hour, the two women heard a knock on the front door. And when they opened it, to their surprise, the founder of the Kansas City Outreach program was there. He was a smiling, well-dressed, middle-aged man in a long trench coat. And after introducing himself, he walked back to the car and stood there ready to open the car door for Lisa. Lisa carefully wrapped her baby, Tiffany, in her warmest blanket and tucked her into the car seat that was sitting near the front door. Then Lisa said goodbye to her sister-in-law, and then she picked up the car seat and shielded Tiffany from the snow as she walked quickly down the front steps and out to the waiting car. She strapped her infant into the back seat, then Lisa slid into the front passenger seat, where she buckled up and then waved and smiled at Kathy as the car pulled away from the curb. Over the next several weeks, Lisa, who normally spoke with her mother all the time, stopped calling. Concerned, Lisa's mother contacted the Kansas City police, and the police asked her if, besides phone calls, had she had any other interactions with her daughter recently, and Lisa's mother would hesitate, but would say yes, she had. Not long after Lisa's calls had stopped, Lisa's mother had received a typewritten note from Lisa that had her daughter's signature written out at the bottom that claimed Lisa was doing just fine and that she didn't need anything, but there was just something odd about the way the note was written. It just didn't sound like Lisa at all. 8 years later, in 1993, a 48-year-old woman named Beverly Bonner stood looking around the prison library at the Western Missouri Correctional Center in Cameron, a little town of 8,500 residents located in the northwest corner of Missouri. When Beverly had gotten her advanced degrees in teaching and librarianship back in college, she had never expected to find herself in charge of a prison library, especially after spending more than a decade as an executive with the Mobil Oil Company back in the 1970s and 80s in Kansas City. But a lot had changed for Beverly over the last 20 years. She'd had 2 children and had gone through 1 divorce before marrying her current husband, who happened to be the prison doctor at the Western Missouri Correctional Center. Beverly was grateful that she'd been hired as the prison librarian, but as she looked around at the perfectly organized collection of books on the shelves, she wished that her job was a little more challenging and that her marriage to Dr. William, now in its 6th year, was a little bit more exciting. Except that recently, very recently, Beverly's life had gotten a little bit more interesting. As she heard the metal door into the library open, Beverly felt her pulse quicken. She knew it was her new library assistant, a prison inmate whose exemplary behavior and high level of education had qualified him for this plum assignment inside the library. And when she'd first been introduced to him several weeks ago, it turned out that, amazingly, she'd actually met him before, back in 1970, when he also had worked at Mobil Oil in Kansas City as a systems analyst. Back then, there had been some gossip surrounding the circumstances under which he had been fired from Mobil, but even in the short period of time that she'd spent with him there at the library, it had become clear to Beverly that whatever had happened at Mobil, just like the fraud charges that had landed him here in prison, could not have been his fault. As he walked toward her now, eyes twinkling and that boyish grin on his face, Beverly felt her face flush as his eyes traveled up and down her body. Then, when he reached her, he leaned in close and he told her how very, very good she looked. Beverly's affair with her library assistant had begun almost immediately after he had started working with her, and by the time his prison sentence was over 6 months later, Beverly's lover had promised her an exciting role in the new business he planned to build as soon as he was on the outside. Not only would this new business make both of them rich, but Beverly believed this would finally be a career that challenged her. And it came with lots of international travel, so Beverly was really excited. And so in 1994, a few months after her lover's release, Beverly divorced her second husband, Dr. William, and got a property settlement from him for $18,000. Then she sent her kids off to live with Dr. Bonner, and then she left Missouri and headed off to Olathe, Kansas, to join her prison lover and start this new and exotic life with him. But when Beverly's oldest child died a little over 1 year later, in December of 1995, Beverly didn't show up for his funeral. In fact, it had been more than 12 months since anyone had seen Beverly in person. The only communication anyone in her family had had with her since she left for Olathe, Kansas, were a few typewritten letters she had sent that had her signature at the bottom. But no matter how many times the family read these letters to reassure themselves that everything was okay with Beverly, they couldn't help but think that the language she had chosen to use in these letters sounded totally weird. It just did not sound like her. 6 years later, on a cold night in late January 2000, 28-year-old Suzette Troughton was sitting inside her apartment in Monroe, Michigan, a town of 22,000 people located in the southeast corner of the Great Lakes state. She was doing what she did almost every night, talking on the phone with her mom, Carolyn, who also lived in Monroe. While they talked, Suzette petted Pika and Harry, the 2 tiny Pekingese dogs that were her constant companions. Outside her apartment window were the familiar streets of her hometown, the place where she had been born and where her parents had gone through a nasty divorce and where she had dropped out of high school in her junior year. But despite all that, Suzette actually liked living in Monroe. And overall, she liked her job as a nurse's aide, where she mostly took care of elderly and terminally ill patients. She was actually so good at her job that she wanted to get her degree in nursing, but money was tight. Just to pay for the few nursing prep courses she was taking right now, she had to pick up a part-time waitressing job at Bob's Big Boy restaurant. So, when Suzette had found this amazing job offer online 5 months ago in the fall of 1999, she could hardly believe her luck. A well-to-do businessman in Kansas City was looking for a healthcare worker to come with him and his elderly father on a round-the-world cruise on his yacht. In exchange for taking care of his dad, the man was offering to pay all living expenses plus an annual salary of $65,000, 3 times what Suzette made working her 2 jobs in Monroe. But ever since she had accepted this job offer, her mother and some of Suzette's closest friends had voiced real concerns, saying that the opportunity just seemed way too good to be true. And sure enough, on that cold night in January of 2000, that's what Suzette's mom was talking to her about on the phone. And per usual, Suzette told her mom to stop worrying. Suzette knew her future employer was totally legit. The previous October, she'd contacted him to get more details about the job, and he'd paid for her to fly down to Kansas City for a week just to meet him and discuss the job. He'd sent a limousine to pick her up at the airport, and he'd put her up in a nice motel for 5 days. He also showed her the mansion where he lived, and he showed her a furnished apartment in a section of Kansas City called Overlook Park, where she could live when they weren't off visiting Hawaii, the Far East, and Europe. And once it was time for Suzette to move from Monroe to Kansas City on February 11th, 2000, her employer had said he would be renting a small truck for her to drive so she could bring her 2 dogs and some of her belongings along with her. Because no matter how sweet the offer was, Suzette had stressed that she could never go anywhere without her Pika and Harry. A few minutes later, the phone conversation with her mother wrapped up, and Suzette said goodnight and that she would call again tomorrow. After hanging up the phone, Suzette turned to the computer in her small living room. A minute later, she was logged in to her favorite website, where she spent the majority of her free time. The name of this website was the International Council of Masters, and it was fully and completely devoted to people like Suzette who were deep into the world and alternate lifestyle of BDSM. BDSM is an umbrella term that refers to a spectrum of sexual behaviors and preferences that can be divvied up into the groups of bondage and discipline, domination and submission, and sadism and masochism. Suzette was very close with her mother, and always had been, but this aspect of her life was something she kept secret. Suzette had multiple online BDSM relationships, and during the last several years, she had moved from the world of BDSM sex online to BDSM sex in person. And in a strange twist of fate, it was actually through BDSM that she had met her future employer, the wealthy Kansas City businessman. This man, whose online username was the Slave Master, had first reached out to Suzette in one of her BDSM chat rooms, and it was there that he actually offered her the $65,000 a year sail around the world on a yacht dream job. And so Suzette had obviously been very interested and asked him for more information, and in response, he had paid for her to come to Kansas to learn more. During those 5 days, Suzette spent a little time learning about the dream job and a lot of time being the slave master's slave. She had even signed his so-called slave contract, which said he had full control over her and could punish her however and whenever he wanted. For 5 days, the slave master filmed himself having his way with Suzette. And when Suzette had come back to Monroe, she would spend hours re-watching those videos, fantasizing about doing it all over again when she headed off to begin working for him. Finally, February 11th rolled around, and it was time for Suzette to leave Monroe and head off to Kansas City. Suzette kissed her mom and other family members goodbye. She tucked Pika and Harry into their deluxe travel cases, and then she climbed into the truck that the slave master had rented for her, and then she began the 750-mile drive west to Kansas City. A few weeks later, on March 1st, from her motel room in Kansas City, Suzette sent a message on her computer to a fellow BDSM enthusiast to say that she and the slave master were finally leaving for their around-the-world yacht trip with her master's elderly father, and that she was really excited and that this experience was going to be a lot of fun. At 10:30 that morning, the slave master opened the door of Suzette's motel room and walked inside. He looked around, happy to see that Suzette had packed up the last of her things and was ready to go, but before they left, there was just one more thing he needed Suzette to do. He walked across the room and put the blank pieces of paper he had been holding down on a table, and then he gestured for Suzette to come over. He told her to sign her name at the bottom of each page. This way, he said, she'd be reminded to write some letters to her family once they were out at sea. He said he could even help her type some of the letters up since he'd be bringing along his typewriter. Suzette, who was a terrible speller and who preferred messaging on the computer over letter writing, thought this was a good idea. And after she'd signed her name to each page, she turned her attention to making sure that her dogs had finished their food and that they were snuggled down inside of their carrying case. A few minutes later, Suzette was in the car with the slave master on their way to pick up his father. But as they drove, the slave master suddenly turned to her and said, "Before we get my dad, I want to take you somewhere." He told her he wanted to show her a piece of farm property that he owned in Lynn County, which was just outside of Kansas City. Suzette grinned and said, "Okay," thinking her master must want one more sexual encounter before they set sail. And sure enough, after they had arrived at the single trailer on a deserted stretch of flat farmland 60 miles south of Olathe, the slave master parked the car, reached into the glove compartment, and pulled out a blindfold and a length of rope. Suzette smiled. She could tell by the expression on his face that he clearly had something very special planned for her. A few hours later, the slave master was back in his car, except this time he was alone, minus Suzette's 2 dogs who were whining in the back seat. The slave master wiped some sweat from his brow, then he fired up the car engine, pulled out of the dirt lot onto the road. A few weeks later, Suzette's mother, Carolyn, would receive a typewritten letter in the mail from her daughter. And in this letter, her daughter would tell her how great the cruise was going so far. And at the bottom of the letter was her daughter's signature. But just like Lisa Stassi's family and Beverly Bonner's family, Carolyn and the rest of Suzette's family thought this letter just didn't seem right. It didn't sound like Suzette. But what made Suzette's family especially skeptical of this letter was that one of her dog's names had been badly misspelled. Not just a typo, but a full-blown misspelling. Suzette adored her dogs like they were her children, and she would never have spelled the dog's name that way. And so the combination of this egregious spelling error, combined with the overall alien feel of the letter, convinced Suzette's family that Suzette simply could not have been the letter's author. But the implications of this were not clear. Did this mean Suzette was in trouble? Was this letter just a prank? They didn't know. But they had no way of actually getting in touch with Suzette because she was out on this yacht, so there was no phone number for her. So with nothing else to do, the family just kind of began digging into Suzette's life to see if there was anything they could find. And her family quickly discovered that Suzette was a part of this BDSM community, but more importantly, they discovered that the Kansas City businessman who had offered Suzette this dream job was also a member of the BDSM community, and his username was the Slave Master. And when the family began reaching out to people in this community that had heard of the Slave Master, no one had nice things to say about him. And so at this discovery, Suzette's mother, Carolyn, just got this really bad feeling that something had happened to her daughter. And so she called the Kansas City police. And on this call, she would tell them that, she can't get in touch with her daughter, and she's gotten these letters from her daughter, but it doesn't sound like her. And then at the end of her initial story of what's going on with her daughter, she would tell the police that the last person she believed her daughter was with was her new employer, a man who called himself the Slave Master online. Now, at first, the police, as they're listening to Carolyn, they were a little bit dismissive of her story because it sounded like her adult daughter had chosen to go do something and she was sending letters, so she was in touch. So what was the big deal? But when they heard Carolyn mention the Slave Master part of the story, everything changed because the police knew exactly who the Slave Master was. A few months later, in the spring of 2000, 15-year-old Heather Robinson was sitting in her bedroom in her family's house in Chicago, Illinois, listening to her parents arguing downstairs. As she tossed her long brown hair over her shoulders, Heather was thinking to herself, did her parents really believe that she couldn't hear them fighting? And did they really think that over the last year she hadn't noticed that arguments like this one were becoming more and more frequent? It actually wasn't even the arguing that bothered Heather the most. It was the fact that her parents tried to act like these fights weren't even happening, like everything was just fine, and this totally annoyed and stressed Heather out. But the truth was, at the age of 15, everything bothered Heather, including the fact that she was an only child, and she didn't have any siblings to talk with about her parents going through this rough patch and about how way overprotective her parents were. They had rules for everything, like not allowing her to take phone calls after 9 p.m. or telling her it was time to get off the family computer when she was mid-conversation with her friends. And with her 16th birthday and driver's license coming up that fall, she was sure they'd be making up even more rules for her. As she sat there wishing she had a little more independence, Heather suddenly remembered that offer her uncle had made her almost a year earlier. It was back when one of his 4 kids was getting married, and Heather and her parents, Donald and Frida Robinson, had flown down to Florida for her cousin's wedding. And after the wedding, during the big reception, Heather's uncle had pulled her out onto the dance floor. Heather didn't know her uncle very well. He and his wife lived 6 hours away from them, and her uncle was 10 years older than her own father, so the two brothers hadn't really grown up together. And except for special occasions like this wedding, they really only got together once a year at an annual family reunion. Now, as Heather recalled that actual dance with her uncle, she shuddered. Her uncle, who had been drinking at the reception, had suddenly gotten way too close to her, kind of rubbing up against her. However, just as quickly as he had started doing that, he had stopped, and then taking hold of one of her arms and said, it looks like things are kind of rough right now with your parents, and if you ever need to get away, you can just message me and I'll buy you a plane ticket and you can come out and visit me, no questions asked, just a little getaway. Then he squeezed her arm one more time, he gave her a nod, and then he walked away. At the time, Heather had not been remotely interested in this offer. But now, as she sat there staring out at the dark, cold night, listening to her mom and dad argue downstairs, she started to think maybe she should go visit her uncle. Maybe some time away would be a good thing. A few weeks later, at 10:30 p.m. on Friday, June 2nd, Heather listened from her bedroom for the sound of her parents retreating to their room. Once she was sure they were both in there, Heather quietly slipped out of her bedroom and headed downstairs to be closer to the landline telephone. She was expecting a call from a friend, but since it was after 9 p.m., she was not allowed to take calls. And so her plan was just to stand right in front of the phone and grab it the second it rang so it didn't wake up her parents, who had a phone right next to their bed. But when the phone actually rang just a few minutes later, Heather was fast, but not fast enough. By the time she'd picked up the receiver and put it to her ear, she could hear her father's sleepy voice already saying, "Hello?" Immediately, Heather pressed mute on her own handset, but instead of hanging up the phone, Heather hesitated. She could hear on the phone not her friend who was supposed to be calling, but one of her relatives, and his voice was low and very tense. Intrigued, Heather put the phone back to her ear and secretly listened. What Heather would hear in the next 45 seconds would change her life forever and make headlines all over the world. A few months earlier, when Suzette's mother, Carolyn, had called the Kansas City police and told them about how her daughter might be in trouble and that the last person she thought she had been with was this slave master person, the police instantly knew the man she was talking about because they were already investigating him. Several women in the BDSM community had come forward with complaints against this man. Most of the women had said they had met up with the slave master in person and he had assaulted them or stolen from them. So the police were confident that this slave master guy was a really bad guy. And so when Carolyn said her daughter, Suzette, had been with him last, and now no one could get in touch with Suzette and didn't know where she was, this sent up huge red flags for the police. But what pushed their suspicions over the edge was when, a couple of days later, Carolyn got a call from Olathe, Kansas Animal Control saying they had just found her daughter's beloved Pekingese dogs alive but abandoned in a trailer park. Carolyn knew her daughter would never abandon those dogs willingly, and so she called the Kansas City police back to tell them. When the police heard about the dogs, not only that Suzette was not with them, which was highly unusual according to her mother, but that the dogs were found in the same trailer park where they knew the slave master lived, they knew this could not be a coincidence. And so, on the morning of Friday, June 2nd, just 12 hours before 15-year-old Heather Robinson overheard that fateful phone conversation, the police in Kansas descended on the trailer park where the slave master lived. Federal, state, and local law enforcement would search not only the slave master's house, but also his 17-acre piece of farmland 60 miles to the south and several storage units he had rented in Raymore, Missouri, 30 miles to the west. In his house, investigators would quickly find Suzette's ID cards, as well as some blank stationery with her signatures written out at the bottom. They also found a receipt from 1985 for a motel room rented in Kansas City to a 19-year-old woman named Lisa Stassi. But these discoveries were nothing compared to what was found next. On the slave master's farmland were 3 85-gallon oil drums hidden next to the single shabby trailer. Inside of these drums, investigators found the bodies of 2 women who had died of puncture wounds to their skull, likely caused by a hammer. One of the bodies belonged to a 21-year-old Polish immigrant from Indiana who had been one of the slave master's slaves. The other was 28-year-old Suzette Troughton. She was found wearing a blindfold and had a piece of rope tied around her neck. Out at the slave master's storage facility in Raymore, Missouri, investigators found that one of the units had been rented back in 1994 under the name of former prison librarian Beverly Bonner. Inside that unit, they found 3 storage containers. One of them had Beverly Bonner's body inside of it, and the others held 2 more victims the slave master had recruited for sex, a 45-year-old mother and her 15-year-old disabled daughter who had been confined to a wheelchair. That night, at around 10:30 p.m., just hours before the public would find out the identity of the slave master, 15-year-old Heather Robinson picked up the phone and heard her father give a sleepy hello to whoever had called. Heather quickly muted her handset, but decided to secretly listen to her father's conversation. The low, tense voice of the person on the other line belonged to the son-in-law of her father's older brother, John Robinson. John was the uncle that Heather had danced with just a few months earlier at the wedding, who had been somewhat inappropriate with her and then kind of abruptly offered to fly her out to visit with him anytime she wanted. In a hushed and terrified voice, the son-in-law delivered the news that would start appearing in the newspapers and on the TV the next day. John had just been arrested for murder. Heather was so shocked by what she had just heard that she didn't really hear anything else the son-in-law said. However, before the son-in-law hung up, Heather remembered him saying that John was connected to several women, one of which was a woman named Lisa Stassi. Heather eventually hung up the phone, and then she took a deep breath, and she walked up the stairs and then walked down the hallway to her parents' bedroom, and when she pushed open the door, she saw her normally stoic father sobbing into his hands. Next to him, her mother was staring straight ahead with a shocked and frozen look on her ashen face. Heather had 2 questions. Is it really true that Uncle John killed someone? And who is Lisa Stassi? It would turn out Heather's uncle, John Robinson, was the slave master, which meant Heather's uncle was a serial killer. But this revelation was not the most shocking thing that Heather would learn that night. The most shocking thing had to do with Lisa Stassi. 15 years earlier, back in January of 1985, Heather's uncle, John, was the man who had driven through the snowstorm to pick up 19-year-old Lisa Stassi and her baby to take them to their new apartment that his program was going to pay for. But instead of bringing her to this new apartment, John brought Lisa and her baby to the Roadway Inn Motel in Overlook Park, Kansas City, and once there, he somehow convinced Lisa, like he would do with all of his other victims, to sign a blank piece of stationery. This would allow him to write letters to the victims' families as if they were letters written by the victim, because their signature was at the bottom. He hoped this tactic would keep the police off of his back. After Lisa had signed these papers, John killed her. As for Lisa's baby, John simply executed his plan. For years, John's brother, Donald, and his wife, Frida, who were Heather's parents, had been trying to adopt a child, but they had been unsuccessful. And so during this very stressful time, John had told them that in the course of his work as a philanthropist, he would sometimes get leads on babies who were up for adoption, and if he ever found a baby in need of a home, he would let them know. And now that John had just killed Lisa, her baby suddenly needed a home. So he called his brother and gave him the good news. And Donald, feeling incredibly lucky and grateful and believing the whole process had been totally legal, happily agreed to take this baby, and he agreed to pay John the $5,500 for the adoption paperwork. This paperwork was of course forged by John. And after that, Donald and his wife rushed to Kansas City where they met their beautiful little 4-month-old baby girl. They would name her Heather. Before returning with baby Heather to her new home in Chicago, John insisted that they all pose for a family picture. In this picture, which would hang in Heather's house for the next 15 years, Uncle John is seen sitting in the front row bouncing on his knee his new 4-month-old niece, whose mother he had literally just murdered. A few days after being told the horrific truth about who she was, DNA and fingerprints would confirm it was all true. Heather really was Lisa Stassi's daughter. But tragically, even though John would confess to murdering Lisa, he would refuse to disclose how he actually killed her or where he dumped her remains. In the story that investigators would piece together, John Robinson was a con man, and in 1985, his cons became deadly. That year, he created the fake charity he called the Kansas City Outreach Program that claimed to help young mothers and their infants get back on their feet, but in reality, John had just created this phony charity to lure a young mother to him so he could kill her and profit off of her baby. This is exactly what he did to Lisa. After handing Lisa's baby, Heather, over to his brother, Donald, John then convinced Donald to pay him the $5,500 for the forged adoption paperwork. Investigators don't know for sure if John killed any more victims after Lisa up until the early 1990s, but he is a strong suspect in at least 2 missing women cases from that time frame. In 1994, John would land in jail in Missouri for fraud, and while in jail, he would meet and seduce Beverly Bonner. Once he got out of jail, he convinced Beverly to divorce her husband and come out to Kansas City to be with him, and when she did this, he killed her and collected that $18,000 settlement check she received from her divorce. After killing Beverly, John discovered the internet. Specifically, he discovered how easy it was to lure people to him using the BDSM community that lived on the internet. And so he remade himself as the slave master online and began brutalizing and killing people at a much more rapid pace. Police believe it was around this point when he became the slave master that John's motives for killing people shifted from killing for monetary gain to killing simply because he wanted to. This is likely the reason why Suzette was murdered. She was simply available. In total, John was found to be responsible for 8 murders, but in theory, it could be more. But John, who is actually still alive awaiting execution, is totally unwilling to give any information up. So there is a very good chance he will take his secrets to the grave. Heather Robinson would ultimately choose to be legally adopted by her parents, Donald and Frida. They truly had no idea what John had done and were, by all accounts, excellent parents to Heather. In 2019, at the age of 35, on the 2020 crime documentary Sole Survivor, Heather broke her long silence about her childhood ordeal. In that interview, Heather said that if she had accepted that offer John had made her back in 2000 at the wedding reception when he said he would buy her a plane ticket to come out to Kansas to spend some alone time with him, she believes he would have killed her and stuffed her in one of those 85-gallon oil drums. Heather, who is now married and a mother herself, said she is committed to finding her own biological mother's remains and returning them to the memorial to Lisa Stassi that now stands empty in the State Line Cemetery in Madison County, Alabama. The headstone there currently reads, Lisa Stassi, a rose in God's garden. In 1985, 36-year-old Michael Reamer was a roofer in Tacoma, Washington, and his boss described him as being a work hard, play hard type of guy. In the winter months, when there really wasn't any roofing to be done, Mike would supplement his income by trapping coyote, mink, and muskrat in the forest that butted up against the Nisqually River, which was an 80-mile stretch that ran right near his home. Most of the traps Mike would set would be far away from any actual trail, because wherever there was a trail, you would have human foot traffic, and that would scare away the animals that you're trying to catch in your trap. And so as a result, he would place his traps in very remote, isolated sections of the forest, which meant he needed to know where those sections were. And so over the 15 years he spent trapping in this forest, he got really, really good at navigating it. It was like he had a map in his head of where everything was in this forest. Plus, Mike was already an avid outdoorsman, and so navigating a forest and being out in the wild was something that just kind of came naturally to him. Mike's girlfriend was a 21-year-old woman named Diana Robertson, and they had a 2-year-old daughter named Crystal. Mike and Diana had a rocky relationship, to say the least. In fact, in October of that year, Diana had filed a restraining order against Mike after he had kicked in the door and thrown her to the ground. Mike also always carried a gun on him, and he had a very quick temper. But despite their significant relationship issues, the one thing they could always see eye to eye on was their daughter, Crystal. They adored her, and when it came to decisions about her, they were always on the same page. It was whatever is in the best interest of Crystal. In December of that year, Diana and Mike were able to reconcile, and so Diana threw the restraining order out. And in fact, she and Crystal moved back in with Mike, which made Crystal very, very happy. Just a couple of days after moving back in, they decided they wanted to go out and go camping together as a family, and then also pick out a real Christmas tree they could bring back for the holidays. And so they settled on an area that was going to be in the same forest where Mike had all of his traps set, and they figured they could, get their family time in, they could get their Christmas tree, and Mike would be able to check his traps, saving himself from making another trip later on. So on December 12th, the three of them loaded up into Mike's red pickup truck, and they drove the 30 minutes down towards Nisqually River, where there was this logging road that Mike would use to park his truck and then walk in to check his traps. So Mike pulls over on the side of the road, they all hop out, and Mike leads the way right into the middle of the woods. There's no trail. Mike is just bringing them to an area where, 1, his traps will be, and 2, he thinks is suitable for camping and for looking for a Christmas tree. Later that afternoon, Crystal was spotted walking around a parking lot of a Kmart 20 miles away from where Mike had parked the car near Nisqually River. And she's just walking around, she looks totally confused, she's all alone, and the employees of the Kmart are looking out, and they see this girl, and they're all watching, waiting for, her parents or a guardian or someone to walk over and show that they are with this girl. But after a couple of minutes, when no one does that, one of the employees goes out and tries to talk to her. And this employee would say when she talked to the girl, she kept looking over her shoulder and she was just terrified the whole time. And so this employee asked her, what's your name? And she didn't say anything. She asked her, where are you coming from? Where are your parents? Who's looking after you? And to all the questions she was asked, she didn't say anything. She just looked terrified and was looking over her shoulder. And so this employee brings the girl back inside and they call the police. And so the police show up and they ask the girl the same questions that the employees have been asking her, and the girl's still not speaking. And so after they made an announcement inside to say, hey, is anybody in here the parent or guardian of this child? And no one came forward. They said, okay, well, we have no other choice, but we're gonna have to move her to temporary foster care. And so they move her to a foster home, and then they put an ad out in the newspaper that day with a picture of her, basically saying, if you know me, contact this number. 2 days later, Crystal's maternal grandmother would see the picture in the newspaper, and the ad did not have a description of, how she was discovered. It just said she had been found at this particular Kmart, and if you know who she is, please contact this number. Even without the details, the grandmother knows something has gone wrong, because there's no reason in the world those two parents would abandon their beloved Crystal. And so she calls Diana, she calls Mike, they don't pick up the phone. That's when she calls the number and she says, what's going on? I'm her grandmother, where is she? The police tell her to go to the foster home and they will meet her there and they're going to talk about what happened. So the grandmother flies to the foster home and she arrives there before the police. She goes inside and Crystal is so happy to see her. It's the first time Crystal has really broken out of that kind of catatonic state she had been in ever since she was found at the Kmart. So she runs up to her grandmother, they have this reunion, and the grandmother's so happy to see Crystal, but she's also thinking, where are your parents? Where are Diana and Mike? And so she asks Crystal, where are they, honey? Where is your mom? Where's your dad? And Crystal would speak to her grandmother and she would say, Mommy's in the trees. Her grandmother didn't know what this meant, and so she tried to ask clarifying questions, but Crystal was not very verbal. She was not able to articulate more than what she was saying, so she just kept repeating it, saying, Mommy's in the trees, Mommy's in the trees. And so then the police show up, and the grandmother turns to them and she says, where are her parents? Where are Mike and Diana? And the police turned to her and they're like, we don't know. We found her abandoned in this parking lot and she wasn't speaking and no one knew anything about her. And so until right now, we didn't even know her parents' names. Do you have any idea where they might be? And the grandmother's like, I have no idea. I mean, I'm just learning about all of this stuff now. But when I came over here, Crystal said to me, mommy's in the trees. And, she's not very verbal, so she can't explain much more than that. But she just kept saying, mommy's in the trees. And I know Mike liked to go camping in this one area near the Nisqually River. He keeps traps out near the edge of the water. He catches some small animals out there. So I know he goes out there and goes camping. And so maybe that's what Crystal's referencing, that they were in the trees. So they were in that forest over there. The grandmother also gave the police the address to Mike's house, and the police used that information to launch their search for the parents. And so the first place they go is Mike's house, and all the lights are off, the door is locked, and his red pickup truck, because the grandmother said he drove a red pickup truck, his red pickup truck is not there. And so they rule out his house, they're not there, and they begin flying a plane not only over Tacoma, which is the area where they were living, but also over that forest that was right up against the Nisqually River. And as they're flying, they're looking for campsites that could potentially be Mike and Diana, but they're also looking for the red pickup truck, which is fairly distinctive. And after a couple of days of flying all over the forest and looking around the side streets and putting people in the forest walking on foot, they couldn't find anything and they turned the search off. And they would tell the grandmother and the rest of the family on Diana's and Mike's side that they really just needed to wait for more information to come in because they couldn't just spend an indefinite amount of time scanning a fairly large area. They have all of Tacoma and this huge forest. And so everyone just had to wait. 2 months later, a man and his dog were out walking on this logging road that was about 10 miles away from the Nisqually River and 30 miles away from the Kmart where Crystal was found. And they're walking on this road and they see way off in the distance, there's this truck that's pulled over to the side of this road. And even from a distance, they can tell it's covered in snow. But it hasn't snowed recently. There's snow on the ground, but the amount of snow that is on this truck indicates it's been sitting here for quite a while. And so as they get closer to the truck, this man is looking around, seeing if maybe the owner is nearby, even though it seemed unlikely given the fact that it looks like it's been sitting here a while. And so after he stands there for a minute, looking around, feeling pretty confident there's no one in the area, he brushes the snow off the passenger side window and he looks inside and he doesn't see anything at first, but he notices on the passenger front seat, there's a significant amount of blood on the seat, or what appears to be blood. And this startles the guy, so he backs up from it and he and his dog very quickly leave this area because they're in this kind of desolate, logging road. He's pretty isolated. And so he gets out of there as quickly as he can. And when he gets to a phone, he calls the police. Police show up and they brush the rest of the snow off and they find it is a red pickup truck. It's Mike's red pickup truck. Mike and Diana's case had been very big news in the area when it happened, and the news had really not gone away. People were out there looking for this couple. And so as soon as they saw this was Mike's truck, they start fanning out and searching the area, seeing if they can find any other clues about what happened to Mike and Diana. And very quickly, they discovered Diana's body. She was located not far from the red truck, just barely off the road in the forest. She was under several inches of snow, and she had been stabbed 17 times, and there was a tube sock wrapped around her neck. There was no sign of Mike, but once they got inside the truck, there was a manila folder that had been tucked up on the dashboard that just said, "I love you, Diana." When police showed that message to Diana's family, they all said, that looks like Mike's handwriting. He used to send us handwritten Christmas cards, and that looks exactly the way he writes. As for the blood that was on the passenger seat inside the truck, it had been sitting out for too long, so they weren't able to determine whose blood it was, but they were able to determine it was human. So between the blood on the front seat, the note that was left on the dashboard, the personal furious nature of the way in which Diana was killed, combined with Mike's history of violence and his disappearance, because he's not here anymore, that all made it seem an awful lot like Mike was the guy that did this. In fact, this made for a very tidy ending to a mystery that had actually started before Diana had been killed. On August 10th, 1985, so 4 months before Mike, Diana, and Crystal ventured off into the woods near Nisqually River, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins and his girlfriend, 42-year-old Ruth Cooper, were going camping near Nisqually River in the same forest. They were actually about 15 miles from where Diana's body was ultimately found, and they were very close to a number of Mike's traps, although they probably didn't realize they were near them. During their trip, an unknown assailant walked up to their campsite in the middle of the night and shot them both to death. Stephen was found right away, and he was found inside of his sleeping bag at their campsite, indicating he had been killed in his sleep. Ruth wasn't found for months, and when she was found 1.5 miles away from the campsite, and she had a tube sock tied around her neck, the same way Diana had. And the knot that was used on the tube sock was even the same as the knot used on Diana's tube sock. So the similarity was just too much to overlook. And so to the police, they're thinking, Mike has to be the guy in both of these cases. He attacked Ruth and Stephen, perhaps because they were, on his territory where his traps were, and he didn't like that. He has a history of violence, and so he attacks them. And then a couple months later, he attacks Diana, and then he flees. As for his daughter being found alive at the Kmart, it would seem he just did not have it in him to harm his own child, and so he dropped her off at the Kmart before he ultimately fled. Despite everything seeming to fit just perfectly to where, yep, Mike is definitely the guy, not only for Diana, but for Ruth and for Stephen, we figured it out. Despite that being the overwhelming feeling, there were a couple of questions that remained unanswered, like the FBI. They were unable to confirm the handwriting on that folder that said, "I love you, Diana." They were unable to confirm that that in fact was Mike's handwriting. Diana's family was really convinced it was his, but the FBI said it's not necessarily a match. And then you have the motives for the two crimes. We can understand one of them. Him attacking Diana, unfortunately, people attack their partners all the time, and so we can understand that, we can rationalize that. But for him to attack Ruth and Stephen, two total strangers, because what, they encroached on your land, even though it's not your land, it's public land, and you just happen to put your traps out there, that didn't seem like a strong enough reason for him to want to kill them. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly pointing at Mike being the guy. You have the fact that he's this violent guy with a history of domestic abuse. He knows this area well where both crimes were committed. You have the tube sock tied around Diana the same way it's tied around Ruth. It just had to be Mike. And so because the police felt so strongly it had to be Mike, they were willing to overlook these lingering questions. And so the police wanted to issue an arrest warrant for Mike, but they needed to be able to prove he was alive, because if he was dead, then that calls into question his ability to have committed these two crimes. And so they didn't have proof he was alive. And so very quickly, this story faded out of the headlines because basically everybody believed Mike had done it and he had run off somewhere, and maybe someday we'll figure out where he went and we'll bring him to justice. But until then, we know he's the guy. For years, no one heard from Mike, no one saw Mike. It was like he had just totally vanished. Crystal was raised by relatives, and many of the detectives that were working on these cases eventually retired or moved on. Then, 25 years later, in March of 2011, a hiker was walking through the forest near the Nisqually River, about 1 mile from where Diana's body was found, and they would stumble upon a piece of a human skull. She calls the police show up, they search the area, and they discover another bone, a human jawbone. And it would turn out it was Mike's. The rest of Mike's remains were never found, and because there was so little of him to work with, police were not able to determine a cause of death. However, they were able to date his death back to almost exactly the same time frame that Diana had died. Additionally, investigators believe the reason they did not find more of Mike's remains is because he had been buried. The two bones that were found, the skull and the jawbone, they were located within 1 mile of where Diana's body had been found, and that area, after Diana had been found, had been scoured. They looked everywhere for clues, and because he apparently died at the same time she did, he would have been out there and they would have found him. So the fact that they didn't find him can only mean he was underground. So this all meant Mike could not have been the killer, because in order for him to have been the killer, he not only would have had to attack Diana and then drive his daughter to the Kmart and then drive back to the forest, he would then need to take his own life and then also somehow bury himself. Some of the police officers that had worked that case were still on the police force, and so when they heard this news about Mike not being the killer, they were like, it never really made any sense that he would attack Ruth or Stephen, unless he was a serial killer. And then it clicked. They probably were dealing with a serial killer. It just wasn't Mike. And their only eyewitness was the toddler, Crystal, who apparently the serial killer could not bring themselves to harm. And so as a result, Crystal just sat there and watched these horrible things happen to her parents, and then probably spent a fair amount of time with the serial killer afterwards because they needed to drive her to the Kmart. Investigators and her family had tried to get her to give more information about what she had witnessed, but all she could say was, "Mommy's in the trees." And so there are really only two interpretations of what that means. Either one, she was just stating that her mother was in the forest, and that would have been accurate, Or she's remembering her mother trying to escape a serial killer by climbing up into a tree. Or maybe even that she was in the tree with her mother as they both were trying to escape a serial killer with a knife. So when the police have this revelation that Mike was not the killer, that in fact it was probably a serial killer, and we know nothing about this serial killer besides what Crystal had to say as a toddler, and that didn't provide any sort of real clarity on who this person was or what their MO was, they went back and looked at all the unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest, specifically around this forest. They discovered that in addition to Mike and Diana and Ruth and Stephen, there were 4 other sets of couples that were killed in and around this forest, and all of them bared striking resemblances to one another. The most recent attack that is associated with the tube sock killer occurred in 2006, but the reality is police don't really know anything about the tube sock killer. All they know is that they're probably in the Pacific Northwest, and they are definitely still at large. Today, the next and final story of today's episode is called Where Did He Go? In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all 3 of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist, he had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, hey, I want to give you something. And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, no, I want you to have them. And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox. And so Sean is like, I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here? But Bryce would just say, look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you. And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim. At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely, he's abusing drugs and alcohol, and I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. And so they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce, Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him that's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, would you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey, Mom, and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look, Mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well, and it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing, independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there, and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm going to just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, Mom, I have a lot to talk to you about, and until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead, she put her husband on the phone. And he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? And your mom tells me there's some problem. Like, what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment, and Karen and Mike are totally relieved, and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone, and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here, and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him. And let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements, and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier, and it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about, and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone, and so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair. He's got a tattoo on his arm. He's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh, yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop, and we drove to that rest stop, and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop. And he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot, and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel, staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side, and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down, and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You gotta talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, oh, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally, his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down. And the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol. There was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. And Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out. He dialed his mother's number and he hit call. And the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone. The officer picks it up. Karen answers the phone. And the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son. He's just fine. He's sober. There's no drugs. There's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's going to go home pretty soon. But there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce. Bryce picks it up. And Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just got to drive home. You got to leave Buttonwillow. You got to come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer, who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no. After you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot. But, the police actually were just over there. They checked on him. And now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what? I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here. And, if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. This is the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back. And he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you. But Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally, at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home, you can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road. So Bryce says, no problem, I'll do that. And they hang up. Several hours later, at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here, he's finally arrived, thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car? And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank, and they say, yes, our son Bryce drives that car. The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Button Willow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. They looked everywhere for days and days and days, but nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop. And then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff. And perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th, 2013, when Bryce went missing, no one has heard from him and no one has seen him. Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please take the follow button on a 70-hour cross-country road trip and insist on only listening to Christmas music the entire time. This episode is called The Curse of Veneto. On a spring evening in 1978, a 48-year-old man named Silvano walked through the doors of a grand Italian palazzo. Silvano was in this big, gorgeous house to celebrate someone's birthday, though he wasn't exactly sure whose birthday it was. This wasn't unusual for Silvano. He came from one of the most prominent families in the Veneto region, so his calendar was often packed with all kinds of galas and parties and charity events. And he never passed up an opportunity to slick back his bright red hair and dress in his favorite tuxedo. As Silvano made his way to the bar, he noticed people looking at him and whispering to each other. He tried not to pay any mind to it. Everyone in his family was the subject of gossip and rumors. It was something he'd grown up with his entire life. So Silvano ignored the chatter while he got his drink and then went to join some friends. While they talked, he caught the eye of a beautiful woman across the room. And instead of turning away or whispering to her friends, the woman smiled. Silvano smiled back. He'd always had a lot of success with dating, and he loved the bachelor lifestyle. So he excused himself from his friends and began walking in the woman's direction. But before he reached her, somebody grabbed his arm. Silvano turned to see who it was, and he saw it was his niece's husband, Ignazio. And he was out of breath, his hair was a mess, and his clothes were totally disheveled, and he told Silvano that something was terribly wrong with Silvano's sister. Silvano kept a calm expression on his face, but inside he was panicking, because he knew exactly what was wrong with his sister. He told Ignazio to bring him to his sister right away, and the two men hurried off out of the party. About half an hour later, Silvano was by his sister's bedside, and she was curled up in her pajamas, totally drenched in sweat. Silvano bent down to ask how she was feeling, and when she turned to look at him, her pupils were so small he could barely see them. She stared in his direction for a moment, and then just shook her head. Tears slowly filled Silvano's eyes. He knew what that look meant. His sister had been struck by the family curse. A few months later, in early 1979, Silvano and the rest of his family stood at his sister's grave for her funeral. His mother gripped his arm, sobbing into his chest, while the priest performed the eulogy. Silvano was stricken with grief as well, but now his eyes were dry. He felt like he'd been mourning his sister ever since that night when he found out she was sick. He just didn't have any more tears to cry. He held tightly onto his mother, doing his best to offer her comfort. He whispered to her that there was nothing anyone could have done. After all, nobody survives the family curse. At this, Silvano's mother snapped her head up, glaring at him with red-rimmed eyes. She hissed at him to never speak of that again. Otherwise, he, Silvano, could be struck by this curse that had just killed his sister and had killed his father, his grandfather, and countless other relatives dating all the way back to the 1700s. Silvano apologized and his mother nodded, and then she nestled her head back into his chest. Silvano spent the rest of the funeral in stoic silence. As his sister's casket was lowered into the ground, Silvano couldn't help picturing what his own funeral would look like when this curse inevitably killed him. After his sister died, Silvano threw himself completely into his work. He managed a very successful construction company and spent all his time organizing projects and visiting job sites. One of his remaining living sisters, who lived with Silvano, had to constantly remind him to eat and drink, and then whenever he had a social event, she had to remind him to attend it. For the next few years, that was what Silvano's life was like. Basically work 24/7. But by 1983, 4 years after his sister had died, Silvano was completely exhausted. He knew he needed a break. So that summer, he decided to surprise his mother with a cruise on the Mediterranean Sea. And it would turn out it would be just what he needed. The warm air was invigorating, and every evening there was a new party for Silvano to attend. But on the last night of the cruise, disaster struck. Silvano was dancing with his mother when he suddenly felt overheated. He could feel his skin sticking to the shirt underneath his tuxedo jacket. His mother pulled away from him and asked if he was okay, and Silvano nodded and said he was fine, he just needed to go cool off for a minute. Silvano's pulse raced as he ran to the bathroom. He knew this was not just a simple case of overexerting himself, and when he looked into the mirror, his pinprick-sized pupils confirmed his worst fear. The family curse had indeed come for him too, and he was all too familiar with what happened next. First, he would stop being able to sleep, his mind would begin to deteriorate, and he'd lose his grip on reality, and then shortly after that, he'd be dead. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. After the cruise was over, Silvano considered telling his mother and sister that he very likely had been afflicted by the family curse, but ultimately he decided against it. There was nothing they could do to stop this curse from killing him, and so he just didn't want them to worry. But it was very difficult for Silvano to hide his symptoms from his family, especially his sister who lived with him. He kept having to change clothes because he sweated through them so quickly. He rarely made eye contact with her because he didn't want her to see his pupils, and at night when he laid in bed unable to sleep, he was too scared to get out of his bed and do anything because he was worried his sister would hear him walking around. About 6 months after the cruise, Silvano sat at his desk in his home office. He'd been avoiding going to work in person because he didn't want anyone to notice his illness. The clock read 3 p.m., but Silvano had already put in a long day because he had been up working since 4 o'clock that morning. Even though he'd been working for 11 hours straight, Silvano did not feel tired. He just felt hot. He grabbed a piece of paper off his desk and used it to fan himself. Silvano knew the curse was only going to get worse, but there really wasn't anything he could do to stop it. So he figured, why worry about it? He didn't even call a doctor. He'd rather keep trying to live his life than cry over something he couldn't change. Just then, Silvano's sister rounded the corner into his office. He immediately dropped the paper, hoping she had not noticed him fanning himself, and she asked if he was going to take a break to eat. But he told her he was just too busy. She stood there staring at him. He could tell she didn't believe him. Finally, she sighed and left the room. For a second, Silvano thought about getting up and following her down the hall and letting her in on his declining health, but before he could, his phone rang, so he answered it. It was his niece's husband, Ignacio. He asked Silvano if he'd come over for dinner that evening. Silvano didn't have any other plans, so he said sure. Silvano hung up the phone and pushed the stack of papers aside and then stood up. He'd already sweat through all of his clothes, so he'd need to shower and change. He quietly opened his office door and tiptoed to his bedroom, being extra careful not to make any noise, in fear that his sister might come find him and see his drenched clothing. Silvano hated having to sneak through the house, but he didn't know what else to do. He promised himself that he would tell his sister what was going on as soon as he could find the right words. That evening, Silvano arrived at Ignacio and his niece Elisabeta's house with his red hair neatly brushed and a pocket square tucked into his suit. Silvano shook Ignacio's hand and gave Elisabeta a hug. He kept a smile on his face, but as he did, he worried they would see how sweaty he already was. As they led him down the hallway to the kitchen, Silvano caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and he looked terrible. He'd done everything he could to clean up, but there was just no hiding the sweat on his brow or the dark circles under his eyes or his tiny, tiny pupils. Silvano looked away from his reflection and took a seat at the table. Ignacio filled 3 glasses with red wine, and Elisabeta brought a large dinner salad to the table. Silvano had barely taken 1 bite before Ignacio made him wish he had not come over at all. Ignacio asked Silvano how he'd been sleeping. Silvano knew exactly what that meant. Either he had not hidden his symptoms well enough, or maybe his sister, who lived with him, maybe she noticed the curse was creeping up on him and told the family. Silvano sipped his wine and admitted he had not been sleeping much. but it was okay. He was using the extra time to get more work done. The only thing that bothered him was that his sex drive had disappeared. He said that to be funny, but Ignacio and Elisabetta did not laugh. Ignacio's expression was grave. He said he'd gotten access to the local parish records, which contained information about the family going back to the 18th century. He discovered that throughout the generations, Silvano's ancestors had frequently died young, and the records said they died from all kinds of strange disorders and diseases. Things like epilepsy, fever, meningitis, dementia, various brain diseases, and schizophrenia. As for the death of Silvano's sister, that had been attributed to familial encephalitis, which is a type of brain disease. But Ignacio said he didn't think any of those things were actually the thing that killed them. He was certain they had all died from the family curse. But of course, family curse would not be an acceptable cause of death. Even in the 1700s, they would not put that down as the thing that killed someone. Ignacio believed the real disease that was wiping out members of this family was some kind of rare genetic condition originating in the brain, one that nobody had ever been able to identify. He begged Silvano to please seek help from a neurologist before it was too late. Silvano leaned back and crossed his arms. He felt betrayed, like this dinner had been a setup just to ambush him. He told Ignacio he didn't want help. He'd seen his sisters poked and prodded by doctors before invariably they still just passed away. Going to a neurologist would only cause more pain and more frustration. But Ignacio would not take no for an answer. He said he knew a neurologist in a nearby town, it'd be a quick visit, and if nothing else, the doctor might be able to prescribe something that could help Silvano sleep even a little bit. Silvano shrugged and then finished his wine in a single gulp, and then he said, "Okay, fine, I'll go, but only if you don't ask me to do anything else after this." A few days later, Silvano sat in the passenger seat of Ignacio's car as they drove on the thin roads of the Veneto region, passing by fields of grazing cattle, intricate Gothic buildings, and canals full of clear water. The view was beautiful, but Silvano was too anxious to enjoy it. He did not believe this neurologist was going to be able to help him, but there was still a part of him deep down that did hope he could be cured. They pulled up to the neurologist's office, parked, and walked inside. While they checked in with the receptionist, Silvano felt like he was being watched by the other patients in the waiting room. As usual, Silvano tried to ignore their curious looks, but now it was harder for him to do. His family's curse and the trail of early deaths left behind was an open secret within this community. He could sense them evaluating him to see if he might be suffering from this curse too. After a few uncomfortable minutes in the waiting area, Silvano and Ignacio were called back to an exam room. A young neurologist came in, and Silvano explained his symptoms: unusual sweating, tiny pupils, low sex drive, and difficulty sleeping. Silvano was on edge as he watched the neurologist think. The doctor said he wasn't sure what to make of the sweating and the size of Silvano's pupils, but the lack of sleep could be a result of anxiety or depression. The neurologist prescribed Silvano a sedative. He said it might not cure him, but it should help him rest. Just like that, Silvano's hope dissolved. He'd known this appointment would be useless. Feeling disappointed, he stood up and thanked the doctor, then he and Ignacio left the office and headed home. The next evening, Ignacio was in his bed with his wife when his phone rang. He pushed the covers back and walked to the receiver, and when he picked it up, he heard Silvano's sister's frantic voice on the other end. She told Ignacio to come over quickly, then the line went dead. Ignacio figured this must have something to do with Silvano and the family curse, so he rushed to his car and sped over to his uncle-in-law's house. When he got there, he flung open the door and raced inside. Silvano's sister was right inside the house in the entryway, and her eyes were wide as she watched her brother, Silvano, who was right across from her at the base of the stairs. Silvano wore black silk pajamas that were totally drenched in sweat, and he was hunched over slightly, moving his arms like he was trying to pick up objects and move them, except his hands were empty. It was like he wasn't even aware of what he was doing or aware of anyone else in the room. Silvano's sister whispered to Ignacio that she'd heard a commotion in Silvano's room, and when she went to investigate, she saw Silvano sitting up in bed doing this weird military-style salute. And then without a word, he'd just gotten up, walked right past her, and marched down the stairs. and so Silvano's sister had no idea what was happening or what to do. Ignacio reassured her that probably Silvano was just sleepwalking and so was not in any sort of danger. Then Ignacio walked over to his uncle-in-law and he kind of shook his shoulder, at which point Silvano woke up, acted very confused, and then said he'd been dreaming about packing a suitcase. Ignacio glanced from Silvano to Silvano's sister, and then he told both of them that, it seems like the sedative Silvano is taking is probably leading to sleepwalking. And so because sleepwalking can be quite hazardous, it's probably best that Silvano stop taking the sedative. Ignacio was naturally very worried about Silvano. Even though the first neurologist really had not worked out at all, Ignacio felt even more determined to find someone who could maybe help Silvano get better. But while Ignacio looked for another doctor, Silvano's symptoms just got worse and worse. He had not been sleeping well for months, and the exhaustion was totally getting to him. In March of 1984, so about a month after the sleepwalking episode, Silvano tried to go into the office to work. He wore cool, comfortable clothing and acted like everything was perfectly normal. But when one of his employees asked him a very simple question, it was like Silvano's brain couldn't process it, and so he literally couldn't answer. And then later, when Silvano tried to just write his name on a document, his hands were so shaky that his signature looked totally wrong. And a few times he tried to speak to his colleagues, and the words came out slurred and totally incoherent. Silvano knew he could not continue to work like this. As much as he wanted to cling to his normal life, he knew his normal life was over. So he walked into his boss's office and quit his job. As he packed up his belongings, Silvano had to face the facts. He was dying. It was heartbreaking and infuriating to know that he would succumb to the same illness that had been killing his family for centuries. But Silvano had changed his mind about one thing. He knew he was going to die, but he didn't just want to wait for death. Instead, he wanted to do everything he could to try to learn about his illness, and so that maybe he could prevent other family members from getting this family curse. Silvano hated the idea of seeing another doctor, but now he needed one. He went home that afternoon and called Ignacio, and to Silvano's relief, Ignacio said he'd actually already found the perfect neurologist. The next morning, a renowned sleep expert named Dr. Elio Lugarezzi welcomed Ignacio and Silvano to the University of Bologna's Neurological Institute in the bustling city of Bologna, Italy. Dr. Lugarezzi greeted Ignacio and then went to shake Silvano's hand, but Silvano for a second just stood there staring blankly like he didn't understand what was going on, and then suddenly he kind of snapped out of it and reached out and shook the doctor's hand. After that, Dr. Lugarezzi led the men down a long decorated hallway into his office. The doctor sat at a large organized desk and motioned for Ignacio and Silvano to take the seats across from him. Then, once they were seated, he asked Silvano what was going on. In an eerily calm and quiet voice, Silvano said he was going to die, and he knew exactly how it was going to happen. Currently, he said he was having trouble sleeping, but he was still getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of rest every night. But eventually he knew he would stop sleeping altogether, and then he would develop hallucinations, and then eventually the exhaustion would kill him. Ignacio leaned forward and explained that Silvano's illness actually ran in his family. 2 of Silvano's sisters had died from this condition, so had his father, grandfather, and various ancestors going back more than 2 centuries. Dr. Lugarezzi eyed Silvano carefully. He'd been studying sleep for over 20 years, and he'd never heard of any condition like this. But Dr. Lugarezzi was very confident in his abilities as a sleep specialist, and so he assured Silvano they could find a treatment. But Silvano just shook his head and said there really was no treatment. However, even though he knew he was doomed, he wanted to try to help his family as best as he could. And so he asked Dr. Lugarezzi to please study him until he died, and then after he died, take his brain and study it and try to figure out what this curse really is. Dr. Lugarezzi stared at Silvano and then glanced over at Ignacio, who looked just as desperate as Silvano, and then the neurologist just nodded. He told Silvano to go home, pack up everything he needed to live at the Neurological Institute, and then come back that evening. And then, after Silvano and Ignacio left, Dr. Lugarezzi and his team set up the laboratory observation room where Silvano would live. The room was small and nondescript, and had a bed in one corner and a video camera in the other. The video camera would allow doctors to record Silvano's every move. Hopefully, this would allow them to figure out what Silvano's illness really was, and who knows, maybe they might even be able to cure him. Silvano returned that evening wearing his black silk pajamas and carrying a suitcase that contained clothes and toiletries. As he stared at the building in front of him, he realized this was the place he was almost certainly going to die. Dr. Lugaresi met Silvano at the door and led him back to the observation room where he'd be staying. Silvano sat at the edge of the bed while a team of neurologists hooked him up to all kinds of monitors. A sensor around his arm measured his blood pressure, a thin band on his other arm kept track of his body temperature, a piece of plastic clamped onto his finger counted his pulse. Lastly, Dr. Lugaresi pulled out this sort of tight, stretchy hat and told Silvano to put it on. It looked kind of like a swim cap, except it was covered in small black circular sensors and cords. Silvano pulled it on, and 2 flaps of fabric hung down on either side of his face. As Dr. Lugaresi velcroed the fabric together beneath Silvano's chin, he explained that Silvano was wearing an electrode sensor cap. It was there to track and record electrical signals in Silvano's brain, which would hopefully give Dr. Lugaresi some insight into why he couldn't sleep. Silvano figured he looked absolutely ridiculous, but now was not the time to be concerned with his appearance. He was doing this to help his family. Dr. Lugaresi told Silvano he would be constantly watching him and monitoring his vital signs. Then he turned and left, and Silvano was all alone in his new bedroom. Silvano laid down and closed his eyes. The oxygen monitor dug into his finger, and the electrode sensor cap pressed into the back of his head. He couldn't get comfortable, especially when he knew a camera was watching him. But it didn't really matter. Whether Silvano was here or at home, he didn't think he was going to get any sleep. So he laid on the bed and stared up at the tile ceiling. But the longer he looked, the fuzzier his vision got. And then the seemingly random patterns on the ceiling tiles started to morph and shift into shapes and faces. Silvano knew he was hallucinating, which came with the family curse, but he couldn't do anything about it, so he decided he would just enjoy the show. From outside the room, Dr. Lugaresi watched a screen that showed data from Silvano's monitors. On the screen, a series of lines spiked, dipped, and flattened out, depending on the electrical signals in Silvano's brain. Dr. Lugaresi watched the screen, getting more and more confused. The data from Silvano's brain did not look like anything he had ever seen before. People typically had one electrical pattern when they were awake, and another quite different pattern when they were sleeping. But Silvano's results didn't match either of them. He was in some kind of in-between state, not awake, but not asleep. Dr. Lugaresi watched through the window as Silvano moved his arms up and down over his head. It looked like he was going through the motions of combing his hair, except his hands were empty and his head was totally covered in wires. Whatever was going on, it was not typical sleepwalking. Silvano would eventually fall asleep, but only for an hour. When he woke up, Dr. Lugaresi checked his various monitors. Silvano's body temperature was abnormally high, his breathing was irregular, and his heart rate was erratic. Dr. Lugaresi glanced at his colleagues, and they looked just as confused as he felt. Dr. Lugaresi didn't know what any of these symptoms meant or how they might be related. He realized that solving this mystery might be a lot harder than he'd anticipated. One morning, about a month into his stay at the Neurological Institute, Silvano sat upright in bed, staring into space. Over the past few weeks, his mind had begun to deteriorate. He spent almost all of his time in that in-between state where he wasn't quite sleeping or quite awake. Without regular sleep, every day kind of bled into the next one, and so Silvano lost track of time. He would look around the hospital room to try to ground himself to figure out what was going on, but he couldn't get his eyes to focus. Sometimes Silvano was vaguely aware of Dr. Lugaresi asking him some questions, but the doctor's voice sounded garbled and far away. That morning, as he sat awake staring at nothing, Silvano actually started to feel tired. And just as he thought he was finally going to get a little bit of sleep, his head just jerked right back up. And then he felt tired, and so he started to drift off, but then again, his head snapped back up. It was like his body was actively rejecting sleep. Frustrated, Silvano pushed himself out of bed with his weak, shaky arms, and then he just began shuffling around the room with no idea where he was trying to go or what he was trying to do. It took all of his strength to put one foot in front of the other, but it was better than trying to sleep unsuccessfully. As Dr. Lugaressi watched Silvano pace around in his room, the doctor decided he had to do something to help. He went into the room and gently led Silvano back over to his bed, and then once he was sitting down, he injected him with a sedative. And as soon as he did, Silvano's pulse and blood pressure plummeted. He almost stopped breathing. Dr. Lugaressi's stomach dropped. The sedatives had sent Silvano into a coma. Panicked, he administered more medications to undo the effect of the sedative, and these medications did bring Silvano out of the coma and put him back into that kind of trance-like state he was in. Dr. Lugaressi didn't know what to do. Silvano had always told him that there was no cure for this family curse, but Dr. Lugaressi had really wanted to prove him wrong. But now, after a month of monitoring Silvano, the doctor still could not give him a proper diagnosis, let alone help him get better. Dr. Lugaressi was really starting to feel helpless. Another month later, Dr. Lugaressi sat next to Silvano's bedside. Silvano was practically comatose, a totally blank expression on his face, until out of nowhere, he wrapped his arms around his legs and started screaming as loud as he could. To Dr. Lugaressi, it was like all of Silvano's pent-up pain and frustration was now finally just coming out. The worst part was, this seemed to be the last bit of energy left in Silvano. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Lugaressi watched as Silvano became less and less aware of the world around him. He quit eating, he quit moving, and so Dr. Lugaressi knew Silvano was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Silvano passed away in the laboratory observation room. Just as he'd predicted, he died 9 months after that night on the cruise ship when he first noticed symptoms of the family curse developing. Dr. Lugaressi kept the promise he'd made to Silvano. Immediately after he died, a pathologist removed Silvano's brain, and it was shipped to a neurological specialist in America. And what that specialist discovered in Silvano's brain shocked Dr. Lugaressi. The thalamus is a small walnut-shaped structure located near the center of the brain. It helps us process sensory information and plays a vital role in consciousness and maintaining our regular sleeping and waking cycles. And Silvano's thalamus was full of holes. It literally looked like worms had just bored right through it. Large portions of his thalamus had just been totally destroyed. Dr. Lugaressi had never seen anything like this before. In fact, this was a new disease, and it would be named fatal familial insomnia. In 1986, Dr. Lugaressi published his findings, detailing Silvano's illness and introducing his family's curse to the scientific community. Based on further research with Silvano's relatives, Dr. Lugaressi eventually determined fatal familial insomnia is caused by malfunctioning proteins which attack the thalamus. As the thalamus is destroyed, the brain loses the ability to regulate the body and the mind. This leads to total insomnia, like literally they cannot sleep anymore, which eventually causes death. The chances of the average person developing fatal insomnia are about 1 in a million, but in Silvano's family, where the disease had been passed down genetically through generations, the chances were 1 in 2. In 1986, Silvano and his relatives were the only known people suffering from fatal familial insomnia in the world. In the years since, researchers have found about 50 other families with the same disorder. There are currently no effective treatments for fatal familial insomnia. It's a death sentence. But doctors do still continue to research the disease in hopes of someday finding a cure. From Ballen's Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Posh Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia